and fire drills. So if the fire alarm goes off, please leave the building in an orderly fashion through the nearest fire exit. Please use either the fire exit through the main doors of the hall or the fire exit to the storeroom adjacent to the stage. The fire assembly point is the island in front of the main entrance to the building. Please do not delay your evacuation by collecting your belongings. Please do not return to the building until given permission to do so by the council staff. Please note that the meeting will be live streamed. Please switch off your mobile phones and turn them to silent. Please note that toilet and hand washing facilities are in the foyer area. Members of the public, while you're of course entitled to film or take photographs during this meeting, can I please emphasise to you that this should be done without disruption to the meeting and can only be done from a designated area in the public seating. Can I please therefore ask you to raise your hands clearly in the air if any of you wish to take photographs or film this evening? I can see no hands. Just a brief note from myself. Welcome members of the public. This is my first seat as chairman on this committee, so please bear with me. I have very experienced Mike next to me and a very experienced Sonia next to me there. I'm sure they're going to keep me in line and give me a dig in the ribs if I'm going off course. So bear with me. Members, your voice will only be captured on the live stream when your microphone is switched on. So please remember to switch on your microphone when you're invited to speak and switch off again when not speaking. Again, members, voting will be done on a show of hands in line with the Constitution. I will ask for a show of hands for and then against recommendations, and will also ask for a show of hands for those wishing to abstain from voting. We can now kick off with agenda item 1. There have been no apologies for absence received. Item 2, non-members attending. There doesn't appear to be any. Item 3, minutes of the meeting held on the 30th of August 2022. Are these minutes agreed, members?
Agreed.
I'll take that as agreed. Item number 4, to receive the declarations of interest. Members, are there any declarations of interest?
Chairman, just to cover myself, member of Barling Parish Council, member of Essex County Council, and I also sit on the planning committee at Essex County Council.
Thank you, Mike. Sorry. Ian, Councillor Wood.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Yeah, Raleigh Town Council.
Of course.
That is in case anything comes up which may impinge.
Thank you. Mr. Newport, Councillor Newport.
Obviously,
Councillor Foster then.
sorry, obviously ward councillor for Roach North and Rural, but also a member of the planning committee.
Thank you. Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chairman. Member of Essex County Council and a member of Raleigh Town Council.
Thank you. Agenda item number 5, new local plan position statement. Members, Daniel Goodman will present the officer's report. Over to you, Daniel.
Thank you, Chairman. So, members, the new local plan position statement has essentially been put together to provide members and other interested parties with an update on the progress made to date on the new local plan. I'm hoping most of it will be familiar to you, and I don't intend to read the entire thing, but just cover the main aspects, and then happy to take any questions at the end. So as members will know, the new local plan is being developed over a plan period to 2040. It will need to set a positive and deliverable strategy for addressing development needs over that period, but also make appropriate provision for safeguarding, enhancing and managing the district's built historic and natural environments. So since 2015, and I appreciate some members on the committee have been there the entire, every step of the way, but since 2015, there's been a number of substantial steps in the progression of the new local plan. Firstly, an informal public engagement exercise in 2016, which was undertaken at the parish level. Call for sites processes between 2015 and 2018, which allowed landowners and other parties to put forward land that they wished to consider or wished us to consider. We undertook the issues and options consultation in late 2017 into early 2018, which was a very high level consultation on the challenges and opportunities facing the future of the district. And then a further consultation in 2021 called the spatial options consultation, which set out geographic options for how we could address certain development needs. So also included in the note are two tables, one of which covers evidence-based documents that are substantially complete or complete, some of which have not yet been to the committee but will in due course, most of which have, however, been to the committee before. And then the second table is intended to give members an indication of evidence base that is currently being worked on or recently complete and hasn't yet made its way to the committee. Both tables set out kind of the broad purpose of these documents. Hopefully they cover most aspects that members will agree are relevant to the new local plan. So just in terms of key considerations and guiding principles, so progress on the new local plan beyond where we are now is likely to include a few more steps. So one of which is a consultation we hope to undertake called the preferred options, which will indicate what the council considers should be in its final local plan. A further consultation on the very final local plan, and then obviously an examination in public whereby that new local plan as submitted will need to be considered by a government inspector who will test it for its soundness and legal compliance. Lastly, members, there are some paragraphs in this note around strategy matters and policy matters. It does summarise the latest position on strategy as included in the spatial options consultation, with a commitment that the committee will consider in due course options for taking those strategy options forward or making changes as necessary. And similarly with the policy position, that's intended to include those detailed planning application style policies. Equally, we intend to bring an item back to a future committee date where we can start to agree provisional wording for those kinds of policies. So, Chairman, I'll leave it there on the position statement, but I am very happy to take any questions that members might have about that item. The recommendation is that document be noted.
Councillor Ward, please.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm a little bit disappointed that we're only looking at 2040. And the reason I say that is that, you know, over the last few years, we have had discussions when I was portfolio holder in regards to investment and the need to look to longer term, a 30-year term, if you remember the conversations we had. And that is common sense in as much as the conversations I had as a member of the Institute of Economic Development was that anybody who wishes to invest in this district needs to have the comfort of having a longer time to understand how the returns can come back if the term is 30 years rather than 15. And I believe I was told, and I think I did mention to you, that there is a bit of hesitancy on investors and developers in regards to infrastructure if it's not a longer term. And that's the main worry I have. I know that all of us around this table as members have always said it has to be infrastructure first before anything else. And to enable infrastructure first, investment has to be guaranteed. And that guaranteed for any return needs to be at least 30 years. So I consider literally a term of 15 years for a plan short-termism, in my opinion. And I've always voiced that term, and you will know that as well. So for me, I'm not happy that we're looking at that. Also, the fact that we've extended the time So now we're running into the period of where the existing plan will now be extinct, and it will be working with the new plan coming forward in 2025. Everything has gone back a year, and there's a bit of a risk here, in my opinion, in it going back a year. I don't know if what is this due to? That's the most important question. Is this a resource issue that is the problem? Is it lack of the information you need to come forward to make the plan, in your consideration, sound when it comes to inspection? I will leave it there. I think that's quite a lot.
I can come back, Chairman.
Sorry.
Yeah, thank you for that, Councillor Ward. I mean, I think just as a point of clarity over the plan period, I think fundamentally what we're looking at in the new local plan is a vision to 2050. So a strategy that talks to a vision to 2050. I think in terms of how national policy talks, it obviously talks about plan periods, and the NPPF talks to 15 years of a plan period. That doesn't mean that you can't indicate what you want to do after that 15 years has finished. So I think it's just a slight distinction between having a long-term 30-year vision or whatever we might call it, versus then the specific plan period that will be examined on, because an inspector won't examine us on a 30-year window. They'll examine us on whether or not it's sound over that 15 years. So it's certainly not intended to be a short-term plan. We are expecting to have to update a new local plan, every 5 years at least. But I agree with you on the principle that it needs to have a long-term vision and strategy built into it. It's just that the plan period element and the soundness checks relate to 15 years from examination, hence 2025 to 2040. So I hope that satisfies that question. I think just in terms of the wider timetable, and I'm conscious that item 6 is talking more to the forward programme. I think fundamentally that the timetable and the programme reflects generally the time it takes to get the evidence done, which obviously is the key aspect. So as we'll get onto, there are key bits of evidence involved: transport assessment, infrastructure delivery plan, that just by their very nature take quite a while. So in that sense, on paper, compared to the last local development scheme, it may appear that there's been a slippage, but I think fundamentally we are still working to a realistic timetable. And it's just reflective of the need to make sure that evidence is in place before any decisions are made, rather than trying to fit the evidence to those decisions. So hopefully that satisfies you, but I'm happy to come back on the local development scheme timetable when we get to that item, if that's okay.
You happy, Councillor Ward?
Thank you.
Okay. Councillor High?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. My queries are around paragraph 3.24, which is talking about some policies are out of sync with the national policy, and the examples you're giving are around getting to carbon zero, biodiversity, better design codes. I understand that Henry Muss and maybe Marcus Houghton have been in touch with you as well around this, because obviously now we've declared a climate emergency, we are able to back up some of these policies because of that declaration of climate emergency. Now, where I've been speaking to other councils which have done the same, and they've been in a position where their climate emergency committee is also looking at policies at the same time as the local plan's being developed, it's been quite useful to get the climate committee to look at things which can go into the local plan around biodiversity, maybe passive houses, things like that. So is that something you will be looking at and liaising with Henry and Marcus? And obviously I'll just declare for the record that I'm the lead member for climate on the executive.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hoy. So absolutely, yes. So we do work closely with Henry, and now that he's in that permanent post, we'll obviously continue to work closely with him. I think we're building up, not just in Rochford, but actually in the county and also just in the country, a much wider depth of evidence now that supports things like net zero policies. So if you go back even 2 years, it was nigh on impossible to get a policy like that found sound, because most inspectors would say that the burden on the developer was too great and it wasn't justified. There are now councils in Cornwall Somerset who have successfully argued those policies. So they've set the benchmark, really. There's pieces of work being done for the Essex Climate Action Commission, aligned with Essex County Council, that have kind of proven that the viability argument isn't really substantive, in the sense that it's marginal. So that gives us a good place to start, and absolutely happy to carry on working with Marcus and Henry about that. The question about whether or not there could be a role for that committee and everything else, I'm happy to take that away and consider how that might work. Obviously, just making sure that we're not duplicating, but actually kind of complementing. But fundamentally, if we're all working to the same targets, I'm sure that can only be a good thing.
Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. I'm going to pick up on some of the things that Councillor Ward mentioned there, particularly around infrastructure. And that is something I think is very important, because in encouraging investment, they need a long-term, they need to have confidence for long-term. The one thing that worries me, and I'd be interested to know whether it concerns you, is we keep hearing from central government, they keep changing the goalposts and moving this and suggesting that and what have you. How will we kind of cope with potential changes that may come forward, particularly if we have a change of government in a year or so's time?
Yes, thank you for that, Councillor Steptoe. So I think it's fair to say there's been obviously a lot of consultations, white papers, things like that, on the future of the planning system. And I think it's probably fair to say that there's kind of two twin processes running alongside one another. So on the one hand, you've got changes that might come through national planning policy, which are slightly lighter touch, less disruptive, but also interesting to us around how you might calculate housing need, for example, which obviously is fundamental to the plan. So, and the other aspect is the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is making its way through Parliament fairly slowly, but getting there, which is looking to introduce a fairly different, distinct planning system from around 2025, 2026, which obviously we're still a few years off for now. So I think my advice has always been the same, really, which is that for the time being, we can only really work to national policy as we know it, but it's a fair and reasonable thing to do, to have our eyes open to how policy might change. We're not at the stage yet with the new local plan where we're making binding decisions. We're not at the stage yet where we're shutting down eventualities. So in that sense, there will come a point, almost like a gateway, I suppose, when we start looking at the final local plan, which is probably, according to my local development scheme, probably in a year's time, around that time, where clearly we're going to have to take a temperature check and make sure that we're happy with that. But I would advise that, obviously, until we know what's actually going to make its way into national policy, I'll be quite candid to say that every time a consultation comes out, it's different to the last. And so there's not really much weight that we can give to that. But I think it's fair to say that, we are alive to that. And it doesn't really change at the heart what a new local plan will be doing or is. What it might change is how much growth might be needed, how much weight we should give to Greenbelt versus other issues. And that will obviously be important by the time we get to the final local plan. But at the moment, I think all we can really do is press on, because actually the risks of not pressing on are, equally severe when you think about planning by appeal and other things like that. So hopefully that helps.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to come back on a couple of points. One that was made by Councillor Hoy with regard to 3.24. Over the last 3 years, as you know, I've been doing a considerable amount of research into, how we can actually be self-sufficient in food, self-sufficient in energy, and various other things. And those proposals, I have sent you. You have those, and I'd be happy if you would share those with colleagues around this table, so they can also see the research that has gone in to what we've actually looked at what we can do and what it is possible to do. I think that's going to be very, very important, and will answer a lot of the questions and a lot of the issues that Councillor Hoy has brought up. And I think it ticks every single box that we've been looking at. And again, I think it's important that we actually try to focus this somewhere into our local plan as part of what we're trying to do. I think as far as Councillor Steptoe mentioned about a new government coming in and what they're going to do, that is our biggest concern, in my opinion, is the unknowns that are going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen, but we do know what happened earlier on, before the Conservative government came in 2010, where the housing numbers for this district were set at, I believe, somewhere in the region of about 23,000, and they were cut down to 4,260, which is the one we were working on, which was 285 per annum. So for me, the incoming government, and I'm sure it will be an incoming socialist government, has almost vowed to make 335,000 homes a year. That's the figure that has been bandied about, not the 300,000. And I would say that we are going to be on the end. This is what does concern me, because our delay in not doing this local plan sooner, that we may be on the end of something that we don't want. And I would really want to look at extreme urgency in getting our plan done before the 2025 deadline that you've actually got down there. And I'd like to know, can we advance it a little bit quicker to try and avoid the higher allocations that I believe are going to be imposed on us? And I wonder, I'm sure the chairman doesn't know yet, but could he give us a date, a possible earlier date for the preferred options to go out for consultation?
I doubt we'll be able to give you an earlier date at the moment, off the cuff. If you look at the amount of documentation that's still to come in,
I know.
it's going to take what it takes. I take your point, but I think if you're speculating about what might happen in a year and a half's time and what policy they may pursue, I think that's a bit speculative, albeit maybe right, but it is rather speculative. We can't plan on that. But in general, I take your point. If we can push on and get our plan done quickly, the most valuable thing there for that will be reacting to the changes that are already on their way through, but not well defined. Even this Monday, we've got a complete change of approach, apparently from Michael Gove's announcement and so on. So we've got to be able to react to all those things if they do come through and hit us. But in the short term, we've got to crunch the transport assessment, the infrastructure specs, and all the other aspects that have got to be done. And we've already got a tough plan to achieve what we've got on the plan. So right off the cuff, I don't see us being able to give you a date. We could do it earlier,
No.
maybe a little bit future on.
If I could just come back, I do respect your answer. I've been in that place myself, so I do know and I do understand. I think what we need to actually be looking at is be willing to make it shorter, because the more advanced, and I think both Daniels will agree, that the more advanced we are in our plans and our local plan, the less likely the government and its changes will impact us. Now, I'd like a view on that, but it is my opinion that I don't think the more advanced we can be down the road of our local plan, the less chance the government will interfere with us. I don't know what your opinion is on that, either of you.
Daniel?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I think it's quite hard to say, but what I would say is that if you look at ways in which, if you think about it in terms of risks from not having an up-to-date local plan, I don't think we're currently in an era where there's much intervention in the planning authority directly. That might change under any government, but that's not necessarily the pressing risk. The more real risk, I suppose, is that if you haven't been delivering enough housing, if you're not projected to be delivering enough housing, then there is that risk that usually in an appeal setting, there may be weight given to that fact, and you might end up with sites that you weren't hoping for or what have you. So it's true to say that if you advance a local plan, then obviously it gives a stronger indication of what it is the council is looking to do, and therefore the council is better placed to resist the things it doesn't want to happen. And there are things that can be done around giving weight to a plan that's advanced but not yet adopted. But I think we're probably a little bit off that. We've still got quite some pressing stuff to do around strategy and policy before we get there. So I don't think we're on, I don't think we're staring down a cliff edge of problems. But I think I agree with your general point. It would be good to, for want of a better phrase, get on with the local plan, because it does put us in a better place to manage risk and to make sure that, as a general rule, the council is a little bit more in control of its own destiny. But I would agree really with what Councillor Cripps has said, that I think the timetable for the preferred options is already fairly challenging, albeit deliverable at the kind of end of deliverable, shall we say. There may be opportunities to condense onward stages of that, and obviously if there are changes to national policy, some of those are targeted at trying to make it a bit easier and a bit less, respectfully bureaucratic to demonstrate that stuff. So I think possibly that might be something we could talk about in a future committee meeting once this first phase of work is complete.
Councillor Foster, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Much of what I was going to say on my first point has been covered on this, what might be the speculation about next year. There's various alternatives, and one, of course, might be a coalition. The Lib Dems are talking about 380,000 per annum. But the question I've got around that is based on the current planning of the Conservative government to make targets advisory rather than compulsory. Is that likely to bring about a reduction in our prediction of what we would need in Rochford district if that were to be implemented? I've got 2 or 3 others if it's all right. Shall I wait for that first? Okay.
No, that's fine, Councillor Foster. I think this is an issue we're going to have to grapple with probably at the next committee or so. Fundamentally, what we can't do is have a closed mind to what housing need might be. So what it appears that kind of recent consultations around national policy are saying is that the government methodology isn't mandatory and the door is open to an alternative. But inspectors, when they're looking at that alternative, are going to want to be confident it's robust, and obviously they're likely to give more scrutiny to something that's coming in lower than the government's figure than they might be to going higher. And there are councils out there that go for a higher figure because they want to drive economic growth or what have you. So the door is slightly open to considering if an alternative assessment is justified, but it would have to be justified. And I think that probably means in some way demographically showing that there's a suitable alternative figure. What we can't do, like I say, is have any kind of conclusion going into that work and then trying to generate a figure that we've already decided we'd prefer. So if it's okay, I'll defer to probably some of the meat of that to a future meeting, other than to say there's an opportunity, but it has to be justified.
Shall I run through all questions first?
Sorry, my mic.
Sorry.
Carry on.
Shall I run through all the questions first or take them one at a time? Whatever. So the next one was about page 5.5 and the subject of retail space, which is mentioned. Just a quick question, really. Bear in mind the way the world has changed in the last few years with online shopping and so on. Has that gone into an adjustment on the retail space requirements for the next local plan? Question 3, my third question, was on page 5.4, table 2. And it's again about the transport assessment. The transport assessment is planned for completion in November. And I think the preferred options allocations is due about the same time. My question is around, does the transport assessment in any way consider what might be built through the plan, or is it just transport assessment on the situation as it stands at the moment? My fourth point is just an observation, really, on page 5.5, 3.12, the priorities. I would like to see somewhere in priorities a clear statement about the priority for brownfield, contaminated and previously built sites. If I've missed it elsewhere in the thing, I do apologise. Yes, and probably a different angle on the numbers. On page 5.5, 3.14, I believe we have a housing waiting list of more than 1,000, and that's come to me in various ways through a couple of local issues. Just looking at the numbers, assuming the government target of 360 per annum and our policy of 35% affordable, that would equate to about 126 affordable, which is about 101 rented and 25 affordable buy. So really my question is, and it's a big question I think in the sense, is it our affordable percentage policy adequate in light of the waiting list we have, which I think is 1,000 plus, you know, based on the numbers we've got on the targets, that's 10 years worth of affordable housing. So it seems like a problem we've got to somehow challenge. And can we influence a mix of houses in developments? Because one of the things that come to me quite clearly is local residents who've got young families aspiring to get onto the housing ladder, and the mix of houses that would be good first-time buys is not a high percentage, I believe. End of questions and comments.
Where you go, Dan?
Thank you, Councillor Foster. So you'll have to forgive me if I've forgotten or get the order wrong. But just so, firstly, just on the retail floor space, so we will bring where that figure has come from to this committee. So essentially, it's a retail and leisure needs assessment update that was done around a month or so ago. Now we do plan to bring quite a bit of evidence before the committee over the autumn. It's based loosely on a model that essentially is built from a ton of data that goes through some kind of sausage machine and projects forward as to the likely retail need per person, for example, and then that's aggregated up into a fairly rounded assessment of what's likely to be needed in a specific area. So that model, it's an extension of what used to be called the East of England forecasting model, but essentially it's a similar thing. That builds in kind of projected and current trends in retail demand. So no doubt if you run the model today, it will produce a lower figure than it might have done 10 years ago when perhaps there was more demand. It also takes into account the impacts of COVID, which have basically accelerated clearly the loss of a bit of retail. So it is in that sense an up-to-date measure based on current and expected trends. It's not kind of an archaic model that looks at how things used to be. But obviously we can get into that when we bring that assessment. So in terms of local plan transport assessment, so fundamentally the first stage of work is going to have two elements which kind of encapsulate both aspects of what you said. So there is that need for a kind of baselining exercise, and then there is also a need to kind of consider what different options, the impact different options for growth would have on the transport network, and how mitigation, i.e. new junction, new road, whatever that might be, could alleviate some of that mitigation. So that November date is when we expect to have the very final report from that options testing. But there is going to have to be a need for this committee to inform the options that go into that to be tested. And naturally, there will be outcomes of that work that arrive before the final glossy report, which means that we can be reporting to the committee and talking about preferred options. So it shouldn't be the case that report lands and then we have to come to the committee to start talking to you for the first time about preferred option. There should be a bit more synchronicity. It's just obviously like to bring, for want of a better phrase, the kind of final glossy report to the committee, and that's that date essentially in that report. It is obviously quite tight, but we're being kind of not ambitious, but we're hoping to kind of make substantive progress reflecting what Councillor Ward said. In terms of strategic priorities, I think what I didn't do was list out the whole range of what's under these, which are strategic objectives. So within those strategic objectives, you will find things around brownfield prioritisation, and that is kind of encaptured quite a lot of what we've done with the local plan to date. So those priorities are a little bit more high level, kind of just existing as categories, if you like. In terms of the housing need and relationship with affordable housing, I mean, what you will find is in Rochford and in lots of places, if you were to work it out as a percentage, you could make a case to say that probably over half of the houses that need to be built in an area would need to be affordable tenures in order to meet demand in full. That's not uncommon. What we are constrained by in terms of local plans and planning applications is obviously we will have to demonstrate through the local plan that our affordable housing policy doesn't render development unviable. And so 35%, which is the current policy, is essentially that compromise as of 2011 when that, or 2011 to 2014 when those documents were progressed. What we will have to do for the new local plan is consider the case for a higher percentage. Clearly, that high percentage has to be weighed against that viability thing, because that's what an inspector is going to do. We may be able to achieve a 40%, 45% policy. We'll obviously have to review the housing mix within that tenure between rent and shared ownership, etc. But there is just that. We don't have complete autonomy, if you like, over that percentage. But obviously totally take that point on that you said. Lastly, just on housing mix, I mean, yes, the new local plan will have to have a policy which talks to the appropriate housing mix on sites. Typically, it's still a matter for negotiation at planning application stage, but we can certainly give an indication of what we think an appropriate mix is likely to be, whether that's types of home or number of bedrooms, etc. We do already have a policy that does that, but it's like I say, there is that element of negotiation on individual planning applications. So it's I would say it's also informed by kind of contemporaneous liaison with, say, our council's housing team, for example, who might say that policy is slightly out of date now. So hopefully that's helpful.
Councillor Stepton.
Thank you, Chairman. The one phrase that worries me more than anything else with the local plan, it's a simple phrase that says duty to cooperate. It worries me more than anything else, particularly in the southern areas, particularly out towards the east, where Southend has very little space to actually move. They may not look to us for housing, but they could be looking to us for infrastructure to relieve their housing problem. How much weight do we have to give with duty to cooperate, and how much feedback can we put into it to control the amount that Southend, for example, could come forward with?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Steptoe. So I think the fundamental thing to say at the start is obviously a local plan in Rochford, for example, can only set policies and strategy for Rochford. It can't bind a neighbouring authority to do anything, and vice versa. No neighbouring authority can't bind a Rochford plan to do anything. For the time being, duty to cooperate remains in law. I think it's probably my catchphrase, but it isn't necessarily a duty to agree, but you have to obviously work collaboratively with other public sector partners to kind of agree and try and forge a way forward where you can. That's not to say that, you can be bound into doing something that is, let's say in the planning context, just not sustainable to do. So I think what I would say on a strategy level is that the strategy of the Rochford local plan is for Rochford Council and yourselves as councillors to decide. The duty to cooperate exists to help us work with those neighbouring authorities and others to try and work out if there are opportunities to do stuff that is better or to link things up. And there are positives that can come out of that. Obviously, you don't want to be both, you and a neighbouring council planning for something and then you don't talk to one another and then you find that you've both built the road, half a kilometre apart or what have you. So there is that advantage. The only thing I would say is that obviously part of the government consultations is suggesting the duty to cooperate will be replaced with a less binding policy test around alignment. So I expect that probably will come into the fore in the next 6 months or so. And I would guess that will be more about showing to an inspector that one has acted reasonably and that you've aligned where you can, rather than the kind of duty to cooperate legal test, which some plans were basically being thrown out on the first day of examination because they hadn't met. So it does look like the duty to cooperate will be replaced, but I would just reassure you that obviously it is Rochford's plan we're talking about, and it's for Rochford Council to determine what goes in it.
Am I right in assuming that councils such as Southend, perhaps Chelmsford, Basildon, will have the right of consultation with our plan?
Yes, so absolutely. So whenever anyone goes out on a formal consultation, we often, nearly always, respond if it's a neighbouring authority. Likewise, neighbouring authorities can respond to us. So that's, if you like, the formal level of engagement. But obviously, you can imagine at an officer level, there's lots of informal engagement around all kinds of planning issues that we can report to the committee as and when, obviously, it relates to the new local plan.
Councillor Ward?
Thank you very much, Chairman. There was a kind of interesting point that Councillor Foster brought up, which I'd like to explore, if I may. It goes from 3.2, it's on page 5.5, and it goes 3.12, it's going to be 3.13 and 3.14, if I can just take those as they go. We've got our 5 strategic priorities, which are down there. Now, a couple of those, yes, are within our control, but there are quite a few that are totally outside of our control, where we're going to have to kind of make some kind of partnership or some kind of arrangement with those people and those providers to making things. And I'm looking at strategic priority 4, which sort of hits me, which is sufficient provision of health. I think one of the big problems, as far as that is concerned, is that it's outside of our remit completely. No matter what we do, it's going to be down to the county to decide. And I guess education is exactly the same. No matter what we do, we can provide a spot for it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the county or NHS will take that spot up. And what happens, and what always happens, is that us as councillors are blamed by the residents, basically because, hang on a second, this was supposed to be provided and it isn't. And it's not in our remit to be able to do that. We have provided the spot that it can go on, but it's not down to us to actually fill that spot in. And I think that's something that needs to be highlighted, you know, the whole way through, whatever we're doing, to ensure that members, the public, our residents, understand how limited some of our remits are in doing this plan. And going on from that, an interesting point that Councillor Foster made in regards to the actual numbers. Now, I do have a problem with both 313 and 314. And at the very end of 314, I think the last bit, this equates to a need for around 6,500 additional homes by 2040. Whilst use of this method is not mandatory, use of an alternative method requires exceptional justification. Well, I think we do have that exceptional justification provided by the government. It's their own figures in both the ONS and the census, because the ONS definitively shows that births are going down and deaths are going up. So we're having a squeezing of the demographic around the country and here. And the census, well, that actually made a total nonsense of the modelling that they did for that period of 2011, 2021, where they got the growth completely wrong. It was a lot lower than the modelling. So, I mean, I would be wanting to challenge the government very, very robustly, using their own evidence against any modelling they wish to put in place. Now, I'd like a view on that from yourselves, please.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Ward. So, I mean, in terms of that priority, I know what you say, that, you know, health is the remit of the NHS and some matters remit the Essex County Council. I think there are things we can do in the local plan that make good outcomes for those things more likely. we don't have absolute control. And obviously that's something we're going to have to ponder at every stage. I think obviously those priorities reflect ambitions. So in a sense, we don't want the ambitions to read negatively, but I take what you say. And I think, it's a fair comment that we'll have to ponder as we develop the strategy. I think just in terms of the housing numbers, and I think, to be honest, it's probably something we should discuss in a future meeting, in the wider picture. Fundamentally, I think there is quite a lot of concern across the country about whether or not the demographics of the government's method are valid or not. I think we can have that discussion. The only thing I would say is, for better or worse, I think the government have set a very high bar to meet. And actually, there's probably more of a conversation around thinking about whether or not we can sustainably meet that number, what we might need in terms of infrastructure in order to be able to meet that number. That might be a more fruitful kind of debate, because there is, like I say, a very high bar to convince an inspector that the method is flawed. It might soften, because obviously the government has reiterated that it's a mandatory figure. So there might be cases where it gets challenged and then sets a precedent. For the time being, I would say that bar, as far as I can see, remains very high, and it's a cause of lots of plans being found unsound, where they propose to build fewer homes. So hopefully that covers your questions.
Sorry, members, any other questions? No? Okay.
Sorry, Chairman. Just one, and maybe I'm being a bit stupid here, but the numbers, this period is from 2025 to 2040, right? Correct?
So those figures, I think, are more reflecting the need from now. But you're right, at the point of the plan being examined, it will need to demonstrate 15 years, which would be 25 to 2040. So if you like, it's 15 times 360 at the point of the plan being found sound.
Which is 5,400.
If you take off the numbers that are needed between now and then, you may well be right. I probably can't do that mental maths.
Okay.
Okay. At the end of 5.1, there's one recommendation set out in 5.1 of the report, that the Planning Policy Committee notes the new local plan position statement. Members, is that noted? Thank you. We push on. Item number 6, Local Development Scheme 22-25. Again, I hand over to Daniel Goodman to present the officer's report on that one.
Thank you, Chairman. So members, the local development scheme is a formal document that the council is obliged to prepare, which essentially sets out a forward programme and timetable for its local plan, and any other statutory planning documents, such as supplementary planning documents, for example. So the last local development scheme was adopted around the same time as the spatial options consultation. I think, as we've touched upon, it predicted a preferred options consultation sooner than now. So clearly there's a need to set a new local development scheme which sets a more up-to-date timetable. So there is essentially a table which sets out the timetable for the new local plan. It envisages a preferred options consultation this winter. I think if you look at the other appendix, we've indicated that's likely to be early next year. And then further stages in winter 2024, and then ultimately submitting in 2025 for examination. Clearly, this is the kind of document that you do need to review regularly to make sure it remains up to date. So there may be a need to review this in a subsequent committee meeting, but this is the timetable that is being recommended to members at this time. I think, as I've said, it is quite an ambitious timetable, but it's one that I think we feel is at the end of being deliverable, whilst also managing some of those risks that we've spoken about around not having an up-to-date local plan. There is also at Appendix B, I believe, a kind of Gantt chart, which appreciates a little bit of a visual mess, but hopefully the principle is clear around how some of the subtasks are likely to progress over that period. We've only done it in detail up to the preferred options consultation. Obviously, we will keep this kind of document up to date. Something we have tried to demonstrate is the interdependency between some of the evidence. Clearly, there are matters such as local plan transport assessment and infrastructure delivery plan that need some kind of indication of what we want to test. And there's obviously a relationship between essentially plugging the outputs of one into the other and so on. Hence why there are some arrows pointing between different rows on the Gantt chart. So I'll stop there, members. The recommendations, I believe, are that the local development scheme itself be recommended to council for adoption, and that Appendix B, I believe it is, the Gantt chart be noted. Thank you.
Councillor Hyde?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I wasn't sure where to raise this, either in the minutes of the previous meeting or on this item, because it's the only other place where it's mentioned. On the Appendix B, I think that is, we've got on the first section, complete evidence. The bottom one is open spaces study. It says complete, it's incomplete evidence. However, at the last meeting, this was sent back for additional work, and we haven't seen it in this committee at all yet. So I'm not sure how it can be complete if we've not agreed it yet. That was the main question.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hoy. So essentially those updates have been made. It is still our intention to bring it back to the committee. I think what we wanted to do was bring essentially quite a bit of, not necessarily quite a bit, but a bit of evidence to the next committee so that we can talk about it in the round. So it will come back to this committee. We've labelled it as complete because we've made those updates, but we're not saying that it doesn't need to come back or that essentially it's published, because it's not. So I'm happy for it to be moved into emerging evidence until such time as the committee gets to consider it. But just to reassure you, we are aware that obviously those comments were made last time and that they needs to come back to the committee.
Councillor Ward?
Thank you, Chairman. I have an issue with the Brownfield Register. Obviously, we've got this on the agenda later on, but I'd like to give notice that I would actually like that particular item deferred completely in its entirety, because I'm not happy with it at all. Maybe we leave it until that is part of the agenda, but unfortunately it comes up on 6B as being complete, and I cannot agree to it being complete.
Okay, I hear what you're saying. Daniel?
I think we probably ought to deal with it, Chair, at the item on the agenda.
Sorry?
I feel like we should probably deal with it when we get to that item on the agenda, if that's okay.
I agree. I think it's on the agenda and you'll have that opportunity. I don't want to disrupt this particular item we're on at the moment, so let's clear that. I know your point. You're not going to go along with the recommendation to adopt that because of that. So you've made that point. Mike?
So just to clarify then, because I agree with Councillor Ward on that item. So that means because it's on Appendix B, I'd have problems accepting Appendix B.
Well, I maintain that we've got, if you choose not to go along with that, we'll record the reception to this recommendation that you do, and then we'll deal with it in detail when we get to it. Yep. Would like to speak? Okay, so let's go for it then. Item 1, there are 2 recommendations set out on page 6.1 of the report. The first one, number 1, that the Planning Policy Committee notes the proposed programme plan set out at Appendix B. So we already know.
Sorry, Chairman. Is Councillor Ward going to move an amendment to that recommendation then? Or are we going to?
It's just a case of noting or not noting.
If I may come in, Chairman, at this moment, it would seem as if we're putting the cart before the horse on this. We're recommending something or going to recommend something that I can't support. at this moment in its entirety.
Yeah, you can move an amendment to that, to say that you'll note it, apart from that.
Yep, I'm happy to do that, just to get clear, you happy
So
to?
the brownfield reference in Appendix B is what you object to,
Correct.
times 2?
Yes.
Okay, so you can agree other than that particular
Other than
item?
that,
Yeah,
yes.
we noted it.
Okay, we need to pick that up in the minutes if that's okay. Okay, I'm advised that you should move a formal amendment and then we'll record it that way. So you want to come up with the words?
Chairman, if it assists, would you like to move something along the lines of that the Planning Policy Committee notes the proposed programme plan with the exception of the Brownfield Register set out in Appendix B?
Okay, so Councillor Ward, you're proposing that?
Yes.
Councillor Hoy, presumably you're going to
I'll
second
second
it?
that.
Is that correct? Yes?
So we can vote on that then.
Okay. So now we go back to the same question again.
We did just a vote on the amendment.
Oh, sorry.
So show of
I
hands.
told you I was learning tonight.
Mhm.
Okay, we need to vote on that amendment, please.
As in
All those in favour? 4?
That's unanimous, Chairman.
Any against?
It's unanimous.
you know.
Sorry? No, I can't hear him, sorry. All right. Thank you. It's a unanimous decision. Thank you. It's therefore noted. The second item, that the Planning Policy Committee recommends to full council that the local development scheme 2023 to 2025 attached to Appendix A be adopted and published on the council's website. Do I have a seconder for that?
I'll second it. Reluctantly.
Okay, all those members in favour, can you please raise your hands? Unanimous. I'm getting there. Thank you, members. We push on to item agenda number 7, new local plan, spatial options, regulation 18, consultation feedback report. Members, Daniel Kudler will present the officer's report.
Sorry, Chairman, may I ask a question on this item before the report's presented? It may save time.
Okay?
Thank you, and I'm sure this is going to be aware of this as well. This was again another item that was referred back to planning policy for some changes, particularly around the further analysis on the 141 other responses. I'm really sorry, I've read this report twice and I cannot see the 141 other being analysed at all. So it looks identical to the report we had in August to me. I may be wrong because it's a very long report and I've read it twice and your eyes go blurry, but I just wanted to ask that question. Has this taken account of those, that work which was required, which again is minuted on the minutes of the meeting of 30th of August? Members expressed concerns with the report on the grounds that it failed to include sufficient evidence and analysis. Councillor Emma Hoy moved a motion and seconded by Councillor J.E. Newport that the report be referred back to planning policy for additional analysis, and that analysis was around the other for 140. In addition to that, I did contact Mr. Goodman after that meeting because it had been pointed out to me, which I'd missed, that the appendix are completely missing Holbridge. as an item, and I cannot again find Holbridge in this report either. So they're just the two concerns, and it may be Mr. Goodman's going to address those issues anyway, but I just need to make it easier for him to address those before.
Dan, would you like to come back on that?
Thank you, Councillor Hoy, for raising that. I would say that I have put in a breakdown there of those 141 others, yeah, I'm happy to draw those out.
Just a minute, Dan. The other Dan wants to speak.
I was just going to say, for Councillor Hoy's benefit, I think possibly on page 7.60, but possibly elsewhere as well, there is a bit more of a breakdown on other in that section. And just in terms of the Holbridge Parish Council response, that is included in the long form table at page 7.101 onto page 7.102. I think possibly there was also Barling Parish Council possibly suffered a similar fate in terms of their response not being included. So this is the report as amended to reflect what members requested. So hopefully that breakdown and that information is in there, but I appreciate it's a bit of a tome and the amendments only reflect a small percentage of that tome, if you like, but I'll pass back to Mr. Goodler now.
Mike, Dan has identified the Holbridge paragraphs there, which should take you to the information. And previously he did 760, where there's other work been done. So I'm not sure whether you, given the size of this, you want to be reading right through it right now. But
I'm not sure that's the correct bit. I'm talking about the. Sorry, Mr. Goodman and Mr. Goodler want to continue.
Please. Is it helpful to just start with what I was going to do, or to refer Councillor Hoy to the breakdown? Sure. Yeah. Good evening, everyone. So I'm here to present on the feedback report for the spatial options consultation. This consultation originally took place between the 28th of July and 21st of September 2021. To recap, this consultation formed the second formal stage in the preparation of Rochester District's new local plan, following on from the issues and options consultation back in 2018. It set out a range of challenges and opportunities relating to how Rochester District could change and grow over the next 20 years. The main focus was the spatial or geographic aspect, i.e. presented a series of broad location options for the distribution of proposed development sites across the district to meet our housing development needs over the planned period. It also presented options across a range of spatial themes, which included providing different types of housing for different people, combating climate change, supporting vibrant town centres, or delivering the right infrastructure to benefit residents and mitigate impacts of development. Another aspect was a range of visions and different options for the district's key settlements, seeking feedback from locals on these. It was a chance for residents, businesses, landowners, and other stakeholders to give their views on policy priorities, spatial strategies, and issues around local communities and prospective site allocations based on the latest context. Some of you may remember this item from the 30th of August. It's just worth, and obviously everyone does, just worth pointing out that I think in the context in the committee paper, it refers to the 30th of August 2023, and just a note, it should be the 2022 typo there. We don't have a time machine. After feedback from the committee on that day, the item was taken away and a couple of amendments were made. Firstly, the additions relating to additional detail requested on headline finding 2, spatial strategy options, provide a more detailed breakdown of the types of responses categorized as other. And a summary can be found in the relevant paragraph in this report, which is 5.10. Secondly, the summaries of representations by Holbridge Parish Council, and also to note, on further reflection, we found Barling Magna Parish Council, which had been omitted from Appendix 3 of the initial report. They have now been summarised in the relevant section of the report. It is important to underline that these representations were still recorded at the time of the consultation, and it was just a matter of inclusion in the document. The original report was presented at the August committee last year, and the amended report was presented alongside a PowerPoint presentation as a briefing to all members in March. So in the interest of time, I won't go into the full breakdown of the various key headlines tonight. It is, however, worth briefly noting that the consultation attracted 1,536 unique responses, which represented at least 1,814 respondents, but likely far more because that's where people indicated the number of people within their household. These submissions totaled 6,839 individual responses to questions within the document. Some of the key headline findings from the consultation included a breakdown of the views on the spatial strategy options presented by the paper, a prevailing concern about the capacity of current infrastructure and calls for an infrastructure first approach in the local plan, general concerns about overdevelopment and impacts upon the green belt, and finally, a concern about climate change and environmental impacts and strong support for a range of measures to mitigate against these. So in conclusion, I hope this gives a good representation of the wide range of feedback received from the public and other stakeholders and consultees during the consultation. There is an awful lot more in the full report, and it certainly does go on, but that does include summaries of all the key statutory respondents, summaries of responses by each team in question, and the key issues facing each settlement in the district according to respondents. Happy to take any feedback or questions on board, and happy to provide answers. Thank you.
Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Daniel. Dan, we've seen this report before, so I won't go into the detail of it, but just a polite request that if we do send reports back, would it be possible to receive them when we receive the amended reports with track changes on, so that we can actually see what has changed in those reports? That just make it easier. Is that okay?
Yes, very happy to take that on board.
Thank you.
Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. Just picking up on the amendments, can I refer you to page 7.90? Where you find it? Yeah. Okay, it's a bit there about Barling Magna Parish Council. In the next heading box, you've got Sutton and Stonebridge. Sutton is not part of Barling Magna Parish Council. So I think there's a slight misprint there, because you have got Sutton Parish Council listed on page 7.115.
Yeah, Councillor, if I may, that's where, so in the document, there were a series of, thematic presentations on the different settlements and different needs of those settlements and views on proposals around those settlements. And I think there was a series of sites presented in the Sutton and Stonebridge section, which Barling Magna Parish Council felt compelled to respond on. I think it's just where the boundary between Wakerings, Barling and Sutton, obviously there are some quite large sites being promoted for development there, and Barling Magna Parish Council felt that they had views they wanted to have represented on those sites, just sort of a little bit further away.
Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, could Daniel could just point out where the extra analysis on 141 is, because I know you said numbers. I've now worked out the numbering and I can't find it. I know I've read it, so I'm sure I've read the additional analysis, but when I'm comparing documents, I can't see the difference.
Thank you, Councillor Hoy.
Which obviously just goes back to what Councillor Newport was saying. When we get documents like this, they are large. We do read them, and it saves a lot of time if we can see where the changes have been made.
Thank you, Councillor Hoy, and that is a fair point about track changes, and we'll endeavour to take that on board in the future and highlight where amendments have been made. If I may, so on page 7.60 in the committee papers. And if you look there, so you've got table 7, then you've got paragraph 5.10. The largest single preference indicator was that of other, attracting 141 preferences. The following paragraphs, 5.11, 12, 13, 14, are the ones which break down. So the other was a very broad category, and within that there were a range of views. So these are seeking to sort of draw out the key responses within that. And obviously it's yes. Well, yes, that's correct.
Went off. I apologise for that. So the sentence I just read was the largest single preference indicator was that of other. It's not new because I'm reading from the August 22 report.
Does that include the paragraphs below there?
No.
No development infrastructure.
Right, paragraph
first.
5.11, no development. Paragraph 5.12, infrastructure first. We were asking for additional work. I'm reading from the August 22 report there. I'm not saying it's not done, but is it somewhere else? Or does that need to be clarified, the work we wanted?
I think, if I may, Councillor, I think possibly the lack of track changes aren't helping in that sense. We're confident in that we know we did the work, that some more analysis was in there. I think what I would say about that breakdown is that obviously other represented quite a lot of qualitative views. It wasn't really the kind of thing you could quantify, because obviously people are making slightly different points. So in that sense, there's probably not any meaningful statistical breakdown we can do, but I'm more than happy to prior to publishing this report, to consider whether or not there's some more qualitative analysis we can draw out, or clarify where additional text might be. But I believe there is a bit more of a breakdown in that report.
Councillor Hoy?
So does that mean there are no changes in relation to other 141 from the August 22 report to the report we're seeing today? It might be, I'm prepared to go forward with this report on the basis that we receive a report showing tracked changes before it's published.
I mean, what I might suggest then is that if members are generally happy with this report, we can clarify if and where there are additional paragraphs reflecting that specific request. And if there is any other qualitative analysis we can draw out, I'm happy that we take away a commitment that we will do that. Like I say, I think there's a slight limit to how much we can statistically break it down, but we can look at that. I think, in fairness, I think we probably thought that was the added analysis, but that's not to say that when we made those changes, which in fairness were quite close to the August committee last year, that there weren't other changes. So I think possibly the best thing is for us to clarify that. But if councillors are generally happy with the rest of the report, I think we can probably deal with that in a kind of prior to publication sense.
I'm certainly happy to go back into that and clarify and make sure we provide as much detail as we have on that.
Mike?
Councillor Newport seconded the motion. So
Well, actually, Councillor Ward was next, but we've gone slightly out of sync because I was giving you the option to accept what Dan was saying or not. Okay. Councillor Newport looks like he's got a relative point to make to what we're talking about. So, Councillor Ward, Newport.
Thank you, Chairman. So I don't really want to defer this item again, but maybe we could just put an amendment into the recommendation that what Daniel is proposing, that prior to publication, we received the document with the track changes. Was that what you were saying, Daniel? Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy that we go away and check that. And if there is a bit more that we could have said, then I'm happy to include that in a document to be circulated. Because I think, I might be wrong, but I think we're probably happy with 99% of the document. So I'm happy to take that away obviously, if members are happy to table amendments to that motion, then we're happy to commit to doing that.
So Mike, if you're happy with
I'm
that,
happy
and
to
James
second
has
that amendment.
got,
Again, I do not want to delay this any more than we need to.
no, but James had a way of recording it so that it is formally recorded. Did you get that?
So I think members, it's the recommendation, but you're including wording along the lines, the approximate lines of prior to publication, the committee members receiving the document with track changes, which clearly show the changes from that have been made since the previous iteration, and where if necessary, including any additional information around those 141 responses. Okay.
Thank you, Ian. Is everybody happy with that approach to recording it formally? Yeah. Okay, I'll go back to Councillor Walding.
Yeah, just to follow on, just on that item, I've got another one. But as far as I could understand, I remember being at some of these meetings, some of the things, but there were people there who were actually saying, well, I don't agree with anything that's here. And I think they must be the others. Literally, they didn't agree with anything, any option whatsoever, and they were there, it had to be recorded. And I would guess that realistically, they thought everything that was put in front of them was nonsense. So, as far as that was concerned, how else do you put it? That's my view on what I saw actually while I was there. So I can only put that in. But the point I do want to come to is actually on 7.93. I'd like a comment actually on Chelmsford City Council and how they appraise what we should be doing with our numbers. I'd like some sort of feedback from either Daniel, actually.
Sorry, Ian, I'm reading it fresh now. Consultation was coming up for 2 years ago. Is it in regard to the first line in that table around? Yeah. So in that consultation, it's worth saying that we presented options. I'll say unequal options around how much development should be accommodated in the district. One of those options was to meet the identified housing need as per the government's method, and one of those options was to meet another 50% on top of that. And I think we don't need to get into the pros and cons of that now, but clearly there are some cons. So I don't know whether to read that as that's an endorsement of going with a higher figure. I imagine that's probably not what's intended. I think most likely response was more intended just to acknowledge that that is the mathematical outcome of doing something rather than endorsing an approach. It would certainly be quite bold if that was the reading they intended. So I don't think there's anything particularly concerning in that line in that table.
Okay. Any more speakers, members? There are two recommendations on 7.1. Number one is that the committee resolves to note the spatial options feedback report at Appendix A, which we've already discussed is going to be covered by...
As amended, Chairman.
Sorry?
As amended.
As amended, okay. So
Noted, yeah.
So are we happy to note it with that codicil on there? Yeah. Okay. I'll move to the second recommendation, number 2, that the committee resolve to consider its findings and recommendations when preparing for subsequent phases of the new local plan. Do I have a seconder for that? Mike, second that. All those in favour, please show your hands. That's unanimous. We move on to item 8, Brownfield Land Register 2023 update Members, Daniel Goodman will present the officer's report.
Thank you, Chairman. So this report consists of the 2023 update to the Council's Brownfield Land Register. So as members may be aware, preparing a Brownfield Land Register is a legal requirement of the Housing and Planning Act, and there are certain regulations laid down which specify what sites or types of land are eligible to be included. It's worth saying that the council has prepared numerous Brownfield registers in the past. I think typically those haven't come to the Planning Policy Committee, but I think we now feel that this is probably the more appropriate forum for them. Essentially, this forms an update. So there are some sites removed, which typically the reason is because they're fully built out, and so there's no point counting them towards brownfield capacity anymore. And there have been some sites added, which perhaps either have a new planning permission or which have been newly identified. So I don't want to necessarily get through the eligibility criteria at length, other than to say that the regulations are quite specific, and so they are fairly clear about what types of land can and can't be included. In summary, sites have to meet the National Policy definition of previously developed land, which is included at paragraph 3.3. They have to be at least 0.25 hectares in size or capable of meeting 5 or more houses. They need to be considered suitable for residential development, which is a judgment. Ultimately, I think quite a few of the sites on here have planning permission, and therefore that judgment's already been made, but clearly there's a judgment element to that. They have to be considered likely to be available for residential development, which typically means either they have planning permission or they've been submitted through the call for sites. And they have to be considered likely achievable for residential development, which is more a case of is there any information to say that they are not achievable? Because clearly we don't have the detailed viability information to judge all of these sites. So in the report at pages 8.2 and 8.3, it goes into some detail taken from the regulations around essentially the wording of how those tests are applied. As it says at paragraph 3.9, in total, the Brownfield Land Register 2023 identifies a total of 32 sites meeting the criteria for inclusion that have a minimum capacity of 839 dwellings. And this represents a 19% increase on the previous update. And there is a bit of a breakdown at paragraph 3.10 around the likely windows for delivery of those sites, which, to put it simply, I mean, if a site is small and has planning permission now, it's more likely to be delivered sooner. There are clearly some sites in this register which are likely to be years in the making, and hence they aren't included in that window. There's also an interactive map of the register, which is capable of being updated independently of the register document itself, and the intention with that is clearly to be quite clear around where sites are on the register, and so that can be accessed by the public and others. So that is probably where I'll leave it, Chairman. I think the recommendation is the Brownfield Land Register be noted, and obviously after noting, we would intend to publish it on the council's website. Thank you.
Members, Councillor Steptoe.
Thank you, Chairman. It would be useful to be able to look at the chart at the end, what is it, appendix, the end there, 8.17, to know which ones are now new on the list. That would have been ideally. I'll be honest to say I've had struggle reading this because on the computer screen, it chops it in half and it makes it difficult to follow it through. So I would like, speaking personally, a better printed copy so I can study it a little bit more closely, if that is possible, please. I certainly having trouble reading this. The print is far too small for me to actually read it easily. A couple of questions I'd like to ask, though, is how much work has been looked at on the council's asset register with a view to brownfield sites, and how many of those have been identified as potential sites that could go forward? And also, as well, clarification on some sites. I can think of one particular site which was greenhouses, was used commercially as a retail unit, but is now clear of any structures other than a little bit of footings, is that classified as brownfield? Where does that sit within the classifications? And I've also had a couple of people point out to me where a couple of sites which are completely unused at the moment did used to have a building on it, but the building's long since disappeared. Whether that could be considered either as pre-developed or brownfield site.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor Hoy. So at Appendix A, which is part of the appendix to the document. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry, did I misname you? Apologies. Sorry, Councillor Steptoe. Table 3 of Appendix A does include the sites that have been removed and the sites that have been added. I appreciate that in the printed copy it is quite small. I think it's one of those, we're prescribed a number of columns that have to be in the register, and it's not really practicable to fit them on a page of A4. So not a problem per se, but at table 2 and 3 there are those deletions and additions. I think on the point about the council's asset register, and actually the wider point you made about certain sites, I think the key test is that they have to be, to our knowledge, available for development. And so there are some council-owned sites on here which have planning permission for redevelopment. And so in that sense, you know, we reasonably expect that they're available for development because they have a planning permission. Where a site doesn't have a planning permission and it's on the asset register, I think, you know, until such time as there's an indication it is available for development, we can't really include it. And so in that sense, there may well be more brownfield sites that as this thing gets reviewed, you know, it gets more and more sites added to it. And that's not just council-owned sites, that might be the sites you're referring to. But if they haven't applied for planning permission and they haven't come through the call for sites, and we haven't got the landowner on the phone telling us that they're available, it's really difficult for us to determine they are available. And if they're not clearly available, then it can lead to misleading conclusions about brownfield capacity, because if a site's not available, it's not going to come forward. So that restricts us in a sense to only sites that we know to be available. And, you know, we haven't been advised by colleagues at the council that a further list of sites is or isn't available. And so in that sense, we can't really take anything like that into account. So that's what I would say about that. I mean, we're happy to consider other sites as part of reviews. It's not a problem, but it's just, like I say, unless they've got a planning permission, are allocated in the local plan, or have come through the call for sites, it's really tough for us to say that they're eligible. And obviously it could be misleading if we put them in there and they aren't available. You know, the landowner may well ring us up and ask about that. So hopefully that clarifies. I think what we have discussed in the past, and this is broader than just a brownfield land register, which is, like I say, very much restricted by regulations, is whether or not there's an ongoing exercise that we need to do around theorising the capacity of other brownfield land that isn't currently known to be available, and whether that's a worthwhile exercise for us to bring to the committee. But that, like I say, that wouldn't at the moment be compatible with these specific regulations.
If I may, Chairman, that's exactly what I was going to go on to say. I think that would be very useful to have.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you, Chairman. Well, as I mentioned before, I'm going to be asking for this item to be moved for deferment. Now, I don't want to go into site specifics, but I believe I've accounted for 1,012 units which are not on this brownfield register. That's 1,012 units that is not on this register. So I would like to ask the chairman if we can go for deferment to set up a working party as soon as possible to go through the items which I would like to bring to that working party to show. And I think Councillor Steptoe has some to add to that, as well as I'm sure probably, I think mentioned to Councillor Hoy, he may. Yeah. So I feel that this, before I can accept this report, I think in the light of what we're needing to do in doing our policy of brownfield sites before we look at any greenbelt, we need to be sure of every brownfield, part brownfield and contaminated site that can come forward so we understand what we're dealing with in regards to housing numbers and what we need to do. So that's what I'm asking to move this evening.
Can you explain the source of your information?
This source has been readily available. It's been provided to Daniel Goodman. They've had that source. I've got it in front of me. I have seen all the sources that have come in regards to this over a period of a year or two, and I've asked for them to be put on the register, and they haven't been put on that register. So at this moment, I know where they are. I can give proof of them, but I think it's unfair at this time in the public domain at this moment to name those sites.
Dan, I think I need you to respond to that one.
I mean, I suppose all I can say is that this is our assessment of what meets the regulations. And I suppose, you know, it's a judgment about what meets the previously developed land definition. And in some ways, that definition is quite restrictive. So things like agricultural land, horticultural land is automatically exempted from that definition. And there are no doubt other sites which fail on their, you know, minimum 5 capacity type thing as well. I would personally, my honest advice is that I don't think we can turn the brownfield register into a list of every brownfield site in the entire district, because it needs to be looked at in the lens of just those regulations. So, I mean, my suggestion to Councillor Steptoe was that we look at it in a kind of twin-tracked way. You have the brownfield register, which is essentially our response to the regulations. And then we have the wider work of the committee, which is to look at sites that may or may not meet the requirements to be on the register, but warrant further examination as part of the local plan. That would be my advice. You know, we've considered all the sites that have been put to us, and this is where we've got to when we've applied the regulations.
That can still be done through work.
Yeah. That's right. I believe this work should be done through a working party, hence I still wish to move an amendment, this deferment.
Do you have a seconder for that? Councillor Foster,
Need to speak to the amendment.
you want to speak?
No, they need to be speaking to the amendment then.
Okay. Okay, if anybody wants to speak now, speak to the amendment. Councillor Newport. Councillor Hoy as well. Councillor Newport's first.
Thanks, Chairman. Just a query on this, if this item is deferred. Now, if this item wasn't deferred and we adopted this brownfield register, if a working group was formed to look at the others, this register could just simply be updated with the findings of that working group. Is that correct?
Well, I would agree. I mean, there's a requirement to update it at least annually. There wouldn't be an issue with essentially publishing it, if you like, next week, if members were happy to note it, and then subsequently agreeing an additional update in September, let's say October, whenever it might be. So that is something we could do that would essentially meet the requirement for an annual update and still accommodate what members are requesting. I think that would meet the requirements of the regulations as far as I see in terms of the at least annual update.
Councillor Hoy.
Councillor Hoy.
Yeah, sorry, it's just the questions being thrown in there, which makes it more difficult. I think the issue is that if we put out a brownfield register, which could be substantially changed within a few months, that doesn't look too good. I think there is no reason why a working party could not meet within the next month to do this for publication in September. I've got concerns. I'm sure I absolutely agree with Councillor Ward and Councillor Steptoe. There are probably sites missing which sound quite substantial, but there are also sites on here which I know, since this was done, just aren't available now. They're not, might be small, but they're just not there. They're not happening. And I've got concerns around how others have been put on the register as well. So I think there's three different types of concerns we've got, and I think it's quite important we address them. I think a working party is flexible, can meet quite quickly, and can sort this out. It's not as though that we're not guessing at sites. Councillor Steptoe and Councillor Ward know the sites they're talking about. I know the sites I'm talking about, and I'm sure other members would know theirs as well.
Okay, I'd like to speak on this one, if I may. Sounds a lot, 1,000, which will need to be judged by quite a complex set of criteria. How far have you looked at that list of 1,000 or so in terms of the rules? Because if we're pushing to meet the local plan, putting it forward for you, if the opportunity, this is another exercise. Now, I'm a little bit concerned if we go through this exercise and find that, you know, none or very few of them meet the criteria. So has there been any sort of analysis looking at them in terms, perhaps you'd advise us, Ian?
Yeah, most certainly, Chairman. I believe that Daniel mentioned PDL, previously developed land, and the criteria behind it, which I'm happy to actually describe what that is. It's land which is or was occupied by a permanent structure, including the curtilage of the developed land, although it should not be assumed that the whole of the curtilage should be developed, and any associated fixed surface infrastructure. This excludes land that is or was last occupied by agricultural or forestry buildings, land that has been developed for mineral extraction or waste disposal by landfill, where provision for restoration has been made through development management procedures, land in build-up areas such as residential gardens, parks, recreation grounds and allotments, and land that was previously developed but where the remains of the permanent structure or fixture surface structure have blended into the landscape. So there's quite a large remit within the PDL where all of these that I wish to bring forward include, and they haven't been. And I feel they do require further examination. And I listened to what Councillor Steptoe said in regards to a couple of the items that he was bringing through on concrete basis. And I believe that it also comes into PDL as well.
Okay, so you've applied a degree of assessment yourself,
I did.
and you're confident that a significant number of these will meet the test?
Yes.
Okay. Daniel?
I think the only thing, Chairman, is we just need whatever conversation we ultimately have, which is fine, about potential alternative sites. We just have to be guided by what I said earlier, which is, are they available and are they broadly suitable? And obviously, as is expanded in part of the report, where you've got, for example, PDL sites in the Greenbelt, for example, then it gets quite complicated around openness and things like that. So I think if we do continue a conversation about potential alternative additional sites to be included, I think we just need to be guided by those principles, because that is ultimately what we're going to have to come back and demonstrate through this kind of medium.
Okay, so you read out the technical definition of what counts and what doesn't count and so on. This issue of whether it's available or not, have you got any information on these?
To the best of my knowledge, all of these sites have been put forward as sites on the register, and they would be available. And bearing in mind, this is the crux of the matter, is that we are looking at brownfield sites first. No matter what we're doing, we want to avoid as much greenbelt as we possibly can. We are not going to avoid using greenbelt, but we want to use as little as we can. This is what has been said in the studies that have come up. They want Residents want us to use brownfield site first, and they want to see infrastructure. And so I'm only following what our residents are asking us to do and examine that, because, you know, there's a large number here. There's just short of 2,000, bearing in mind what I've discovered and what was actually there. So, you know, that's a considerable amount. Now, it may be whittled down to look at, but I don't think it will be whittled down by that much. It might come out to 1,500, but 1,500 is a considerable amount of units to go onto brownfield sites around the district, which will save us taking greenbelt land.
Yeah, I'm still a little bit concerned that you say these are on the register.
They are.
That suggests to me that we would have looked at them and come to a conclusion to some extent on those. They would have been looked at, and a degree of conclusion would have been made, which is why they don't appear, presumably. So what I'm concerned about is we tear off into an exercise that actually doesn't yield very much. I'm not saying we should redo it. I agree with the brownfield philosophy, but I'm just at a point where if they're on the register, they've been looked at, we're going to have a second look at them, second guess them. And I notice Yvonne's asked to speak, so please speak.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Just to basically underline what the chairman is saying is that if these sites have been made, put in front of the planning policy team for consideration, as you say, Councillor Ward, then one would assume that that criteria as to whether or not they should be on the brownfield register or not has actually, that exercise has been performed.
Councillor Ward.
Thank you. No, I believe there's been an error, and those errors need to be corrected. It's as simple as that. I believe that there's been an error. They have been in the call for sites, and they have not been adjudged, in my opinion, correctly.
So, Chairman, I've indicated to speak about 3 times now.
So, yes, where you go. Put your mic on.
Yeah, just very simply to get to the bottom of this. Councillor Ward said we're in the call for sites. Has an officer seen them and rejected them? How can we see that? I think there's a lot of people saying we assume or presume, but if we don't know, I think they need to be looked at.
Dan?
Yeah, thank you. So in terms of a standard assessment, when we're putting together the brownfield register, and to be fair, the first register was done when the call for sites
Sorry,
was complete.
Chairman, I don't want to go down the wrong rabbit hole. Councillor Wall said he's given 2 officers a list. I think I'm not mistaken in saying that. If I'm sure Councillor Wall will correct me, have they studied that list and rejected the list?
So we have looked at all the call for sites submitted, and we've come to the judgment we have. That's not to say that there aren't brownfield elements of sites and the call for sites that aren't on here, but the nature of the call for sites is that it's predominantly greenbelt land, it's predominantly agricultural land. It might have farms with a commercial element and things like that, but generally speaking, the nature of the call for sites is not rich with brownfield sites. So we will have looked at it. I'm happy through any process to revisit our conclusions, but that's what we would have looked at. I think it comes back to that point, and I appreciate I'm repeating myself, but it comes back to that point about maybe there's a separation down the line between what fits the brownfield register perfectly and what needs to be some kind of supplementary list of preferred brownfield sites that maybe don't fully meet the letter of the regulations. That's possibly the solution I can offer, and I guess it would achieve the same thing we're looking to do through this ongoing piece of work.
Okay, sorry, Councillor Foster.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. I would like to see both sets of lists before we go public with the brownfield register, frankly.
Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, Mike. Yeah.
I was going to go one stage slightly further. We've been talking about sites that have been put in as suggested sites. What I'm thinking is that I know of a couple of sites, and I don't know whether they've been put in or not. I've frankly no idea. But should we not be looking at sites ourselves and identifying potential sites that may be considered as brownfield that have not necessarily been put forward for whatever reason. Perhaps the landowner was away on holiday. I don't know, for whatever reason. But I think there are potentially sites that we need to perhaps look at and identify and say that could potentially be a brownfield site, whether or not it's been in the system. I think that would make more sense. And, you know, if we suddenly look at all the brownfield sites and say, well, okay, there isn't any more, so we start looking at the green belt, but we haven't taken those other ones into account, I think the public would perhaps be criticising us for not actually identifying sites ourselves.
Okay, well, I too have a view on this. Brownfield's very valuable, so I think we should put the effort into looking at the list. I think Mike's idea to go looking for brownfield sites 5 years after we did issues and options, there's been plenty of opportunities for those sites to come forward in that 5 years. I think that's pushing the envelope a lot to actually do that. But it is so valuable, brownfield, that if there's anywhere near a decent proportion of those that pass the test, then I think we should look at them in some way. But it's going to have to be done very quickly in a workshop in August, and we've got to work until we've finished it, because you're pushing for an earlier finish. I'm pushing Dan hard on all these other things he's got to do. So if we are going to take the time out to do that, then we need to do that efficiently and quickly. And that's my view. So that needs to be put in some, I mean, I'm saying the same as you, Dan. You're willing to look at it, but I'm being the project manager and say, yeah, but I don't want to go wandering off for months doing this. I want to crunch it, and it's either right or it's wrong. And if it yields some significant brownfield sites, it would have been worth it. If it doesn't, I'll be very disappointed, shall I say.
Thank you, Chair. I think that the only thing I would quickly say, just coming back on Councillor Steptoe's point, was around thinking about other sites that haven't been put in. I think fundamentally sites have to be available. And I appreciate there might be a role for the council, if you think about town centre regeneration, in encouraging sites to come forward. But I guess we have done call for sites over many years. And obviously, when you've got brownfield sites in the urban area, and if we're being honest about the value of housing and everything else, they may well have come forward for planning permission if they were planning application, if they were already available. So I think we have to be slightly careful, notwithstanding this exercise that we're looking to do. But as a more general point, I think we have to be slightly careful about starting to scope in lots of brownfield sites that there's no indication they're available, because ultimately, if they're not available for development, you know, i.e. they're being used for a very profitable commercial use or something, then fundamentally an inspector is not going to allow us to allocate them, because that's going to be the first question: is this site available for development? And landowners have had years, like Councillor Cripps says, years to put sites in the call for sites or make a planning application. So unless it's a very recently vacated site, they're probably not available at the moment. That would be my guess. So that's the only thing I would say, is I think we might just have to be slightly realistic about whether land is available or not. And we can't really just assume.
Okay, Dan, thank you. Councillor Newport.
Thank you, Chairman. Sorry, I'm a bit lost for words on this, but there are some potential anomalies on here, which, Daniel, how would I challenge one? I've got a couple of entries on here that we've got Timber Grove, which was granted planning permission, but is it now that because that planning permission is expired, that's why the entry says not permissioned? I think it says on here, yeah, not permissioned, but it has had planning permission on it in my time on the council anyway. And then we've got another one on here, Rock 44, land north of Hambro Hill. And that site only had permission granted for car storage, but I wouldn't really deem that as a brownfield site. It's just basically a car park, and what I mentioned to you earlier. Is that something that we could just remove from there? Because I don't really see that being a brownfield site. So I would like to, sorry, I would like to just challenge that.
Let Dan come back, please.
Yeah, thank you. So just to pick up that latter point first. So I think on that site, so that site has come through the call for sites. And I think our judgment on it was that there's a core on the site that has equestrian use, which isn't exempted by the agricultural part of the PDL definition, as well as the car use. So we judged on balance that we thought there's probably a core of brownfield land on there that might be able to support some housing. I mean, it's a judgment ultimately. Any planning application, because it's in the green belt, it clearly would have to trade off openness and may well determine something different. But that was a judgment. So I wouldn't agree that it's not brownfield, but it's a judgment as to whether or not it's suitable for development, and you could challenge it on that grounds, I suppose, if you had a different view about that specific thing. In terms of Timber Grove, my understanding, and Yvonne will correct me if I'm wrong, but although it had a resolution to grant permission at committee, it actually never had a section 106 signed. So technically the planning permission has never been issued. And so for all intents and purposes, we've said not permissioned, because actually that 106 might never be signed. So that's just, I think we've probably put it in the longer term window on the basis that clearly it's been agreed at a point in time, it's got development potential, but it's unlikely to come forward tomorrow because obviously the 106 is unsigned, I suppose is the only thing I could say.
Okay. It was me pushing to get this brownfield listing out that got it onto this agenda. First I said, look, oh, sorry, Mike. Yeah, you're right, Mike. Sorry, I'm overlooking, Mike.
That's okay. So just because Councillor Newport was raised a couple of items which the view was on one of them, it shouldn't be on here. I agree about the land of north of Hambro Hill. I've looked into that. I think some of us probably have emails from a resident about that as well. And it, to me, doesn't look like it meets the criteria for brownfield. And if we're talking about particular items not to go on here, ROC 41, which is in Holbridge site planning permission for 7 dwellings, that is just not happening. They've revised the planning permission for 2 detached houses, and now they're not even doing that. It's just they're just doing the bungalow again. I think Yvonne will know about that one as well. They're just selling the bungalow as it was, so it's not changed at all.
Okay, I'd like to push this to some sort of conclusion, really. I think there's so many of them, it seems, that sitting and talking about them individually here isn't going to work. Okay. I was going to say right at the end of this meeting that, in my opinion, in the last period, there's not been enough policy committee meetings. And I've already been negotiating some more regular meetings that are going to take place going forward. In fact, I've already been talking about a workshop already on a number of issues. This one sounds like it would take the workshop to do because of the sheer number. So I think we should move to accept Ian's idea of rationalising that list, because the value of yielding a load of brownfield sites is particularly valuable to us, I think. So we need to knuckle down, but that means every member needs to attend. So if you've got the odd 01, 04, 72, 51 and 94, and you want to get that ratified at the same time as Ian's going for it, 1,000, then we need to all be at that meeting, and it's going to be tough because that's a lot of ground to get through. And I can't think of a better way of doing it than putting people in a room and crashing through that list to see what, and if we reach a point where halfway through the period and we've only rustled up a couple of legitimate things, I shall be calling a stop to it. Because we need to be testing this and getting this done, and hopefully it's going to yield enough to work that are worth the effort. So somehow or another, I'll probably need help how we wrap this up in terms of there's a recommendation on here.
No.
Thank you. Okay, we already had a motion to defer this, so I guess we have to get a seconder. And we take a vote on deferring this.
And for a working group to be set up to go through it.
And that will include the codicil, that's based on a working group. And I'm saying in August, and we all have to attend. Yes, Councillor White.
Sorry, I think, as you just said, I think it should go into the motion, the date we're doing this by, and to which committee we're expecting this come back to. So there is a time frame for it, so we all understand what we've got to do and by when, and the public know that as well.
Okay, well, we'll do the work, come to the conclusion. Dan and his guys then are going to have to bundle it up and represent it at the next formal meeting. So that's one of the reasons I'm pushing this to get it done in August. And it'll be one shot at it to get it done. If that's acceptable, then we need to vote on the motion to defer it, subject to a workshop to make sure we call all the brownfields that's available. Yep. So all those in favour? Thank you, that's unanimous. Okay, just for completeness, unscheduled item. I've had a couple of emails from residents on particular brownfields. One of them has been answered by the officers directly in writing. I just want to assure the public that the other outstanding one, which the last part of which arrived at about 5 o'clock tonight, so I haven't had a chance to talk to the officers about it, but that will be responded in writing. I would suggest early next week. Early next week. That's in hand. I just thought I'd make that for completeness, tell you what I'm doing, because they were addressed to me personally. Okay. Thank you, members. Thank you for member of the public for your patience. And see you at the workshop. Meetings close at 9:27.